Okay, people are starting to come in and we're at the top of the hour, so I think we can go ahead and get started. Thank you to everyone for joining us for our webinar today on our most recent report entitled Blue Hydrogen, Not Clean, Not Low Carbon, Not a Solution. We are recording this session and we will send it out to everyone who registered after, and we'll also be taking some questions at the end. So today we have our panel of David Schlissel. David has over 30 years of experience as a regulatory attorney and consultant on energy and utility issues. He has testified as an expert witness before regulatory commissions in more than 35 states and before the U.S. Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Anika Juhn develops custom data visualizations that distill complex analytical findings into compelling data-driven stories and graphics. She also collaborates with colleagues around the globe on research topics that benefit from spatial analysis using GIS and other analytical tools. Before joining IEEFA, Anika provided data analysis, visualization, and spatial analysis for various organizations and government agencies. Projects included supporting FEMA-funded flood map modernization and atlas production at the U.S. Census Bureau. So we'll have David and Anika present their findings, and then at the end, we will use the Q&A function to take some questions. David?
Afternoon, everyone. Over the last 6 months, IEEFA has conducted an in-depth examination of the likely climate impact of producing hydrogen from fossil fuels. This report on producing hydrogen from natural gas is the first in what we plan to be a series of reports. The next will address making hydrogen from coal, renewable natural gas. We're also planning a report examining whether the demand for hydrogen is as great as what promoters of the fuel are claiming it will be. The findings in the current report are clear. Producing hydrogen from natural gas is not clean, not low carbon, and cannot and should not be considered a solution in our efforts to solve the world's worsening climate change crisis. The government and the oil, gas, and coal industries mostly just repeat that blue hydrogen is clean and low carbon. The few very limited places where they do present any supporting data for these claims, they rely on a set of best case assumptions that they say show that producing and using blue hydrogen is a clean option. This is demonstrably false. We have shown in our report that using realistic assumptions about the global warming potential of greenhouse gases, methane emission levels, the effectiveness of using unproven carbon capture technologies, and including downstream hydrogen-related emissions renders blue hydrogen a dirty option that will worsen climate change and waste precious time and billions of dollars in the process. Now let's get down to the details of our report. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, blue hydrogen is produced from fossil fuels. Most particularly, we're talking about natural gas today. The Congress and the Department of Energy have established a clean hydrogen standard of less than or equal to 4.0 kilograms of CO2 equivalent, so it includes methane, emitted per kilogram of hydrogen produced. Now, I should mention that this is supposed to be a life cycle analysis. Now, when people hear the term life cycle, they assume it means cradle to grave, the whole life of a person or a product. That's not true. Congress for hydrogen, Congress has determined it only should be a well to gate analysis, which stops at the back gate of the hydrogen production facility. So downstream emissions related to hydrogen are excluded. Meeting or beating this standard depends on a set of favorable assumptions. These assumptions in the DOE's GREET model that I'll discuss in a minute are so favorable that it's hard to imagine they could get any better. However, while there's only limited opportunities for them to get better, there are many opportunities and situations where we expect them to get worse, perhaps much worse. And the four assumptions that we've focused on are the use of a 100-year global warming potential for methane in the DOE's analysis, and no global warming potential at all for hydrogen, very low methane emission rate, assumption that carbon capture captures nearly all of the CO2 created in the production facility. And finally, as I mentioned before, all of the downstream emissions related to hydrogen are omitted from the calculation of carbon intensity. Next slide, please. With more realistic assumptions, you can see here that the carbon intensity of blue hydrogen will be 3 to 4 times higher than the 4.0 federal clean hydrogen production standard. Thus, our conclusion is that blue hydrogen is not clean or low carbon and never will be. Next slide, please. Why have we looked at this question? The 2021 bipartisan infrastructure law and the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act have promised billions of dollars, first to establish hydrogen hubs around the nation, second to give production tax credits to both production of hydrogen and to carbon capture and sequestration. We decided it was important to look at whether in fact blue hydrogen is clean, and if it's not, in what circumstances it would not be clean. Next slide, please. What evidence do blue hydrogen proponents use to prove it would be clean and low carbon? The answer is simple, not much. Mainly, they just repeat the words hydrogen, clean, and/or low carbon together or alone as often as possible, despite lack of evidence, despite whatever questions they're asked. Their response is it's clean, etc. For example, in March 23 Department of Energy report, Pathways to Commercial Liftoff, Clean Hydrogen, used the word clean an astounding 494 times in a 111-page document, and used the term clean hydrogen 376 times. To be fair, they did have one chart that showed carbon intensity of blue hydrogen amongst other information about its cost, but they didn't really explain what it meant. Next slide, please. How have we investigated these claims? We studied the reasonableness of default assumptions built into DOE's GREET model. GREET stands for Greenhouse Gases, Regulated Emissions, and Energy and Transportation Model. GREET was developed by the DOE's Argonne National Laboratory. It's used all around the world. It was originally designed to examine the emissions associated with clean fuels and has been modified now to look at different pathways to producing hydrogen. We have no criticisms with the model. We're using it as a tool to evaluate how clean blue hydrogen will be. However, we did find that many of the default assumptions are unrealistic. As a result, we reviewed scientific literature and real-world experience, spoke to some people who designed and work on GREED and others. And finally, we modeled over 100 scenarios in the GREED model to examine when blue hydrogen might be clean and when it would not be. Next slide, please. We looked at two main production technologies. I think of it as DOE calls it pathways. The main one used in the world today is steam methane reforming that mixes natural gas, whose largest component is methane, air, and high temperature steam to produce hydrogen. And a newer technology that is expected to be the main one used in the future is autothermal reforming, ATR, which mixes natural gas, pure oxygen, and steam to produce hydrogen. There are a couple of other technologies, but from the literature research we've seen, these probably will be the main ones used in the future. Next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier, 4 key assumptions that we believe lead the GREED model to underestimate the carbon intensity of blue hydrogen, often by significant amounts. Global warming potential, methane's emission rate, CO2 capture rate, and whether downstream hydrogen-related emissions are included or not. Next slide, please. The first assumption we'll discuss is global warming potential. Next slide, please. There are 2 reasons why GWPs matter and why 20-year GWPs matter in particular. As you can see from this chart, methane has a very high 83 global warming potential, 20-year global warming potential, that declines over time to a figure of 30. What the 83 and 30 stand for is times methane, for example, methane's 20-year global warming potential is 83 times stronger than that of carbon dioxide. Hydrogen has a 20-year global warming potential of 33 times that of carbon dioxide. That declines to 11 after 100 years. If you only focus on the 100-year figures, the 100-year global warming potentials, the impacts of methane and hydrogen are significantly smaller, and that leads to an undercounting of their impact on global warming in the short term. Now, using 100-year global warming potentials might have mattered 100 years ago. I'm not 100 years ago, I apologize. Decades ago, when it seemed like the climate crisis was something in the future, decades down the road. The events of this year with heat waves, high ocean temperatures, forests seemingly on every continent except perhaps Antarctica, and heavy rainfall have shown us that the climate crisis that scientists have been warning us about is here today. And if we're going to make the right decisions about what options are the best, we need to know whether each of these options will help or hurt in the short term and cause perhaps irreparable damage, or damage that can only be remedied over a period of decades or perhaps centuries. Next slide, please. The impact of changing the global warming potential from the 100-year default in GREET to 20-year default simply makes the global warming, the carbon intensity of blue hydrogen higher, whichever of the two main technologies you look at. Now, this slide has another shows another important fact, that even with a 100-year global warming potential, facilities using SMR technology, steam methane reforming, would not meet the federal clean hydrogen production standard. I apologize, the ATR production standard, because the carbon intensity of 4.4 would be above the federal clean hydrogen production standard. Facilities using SMR technology would meet the standard, but just barely, having a carbon intensity of 3.4. Next slide, please. The second key assumption that we've looked at is the methane emission rate. GREET assumes a 1% upstream methane emission rate. Upstream means between when the natural gas is produced at a well and it is delivered to the hydrogen production facility. Next slide, please. Why do upstream methane emissions matter? You can see why in this chart. For the two main technologies, whether you're looking at 100-year global warming potentials or 20-year global warming potentials, the carbon intensity of the hydrogen being produced goes up as the assumed methane emission rate goes up, first from 1% to 2.5%, and then from 2.5% to 4%. Again, it's same for both technologies. Next slide, please. What do recent scientific studies say about methane emission rates? They don't say this directly, but it's clear from their results, which are shown in the bars on this chart, that by and large, the results of these 10 recent studies show methane emission rates significantly above 1%. So for the purposes of our analysis, we've looked at a range of methane emissions going from 1% up to 4%, with a midpoint of 2.5%. Next slide, please. Assumption number 3, very high carbon capture rates. Next slide, please. The Department of Energy assumes that facilities using SMR technology will capture 96.2% of the CO2, and that facilities using autothermal reforming will capture 94.5% of the CO2. That's the default built into the GREET model. Now you can change that percentage, those percentages, but the results that the DOE talks about are use those capture rates. But there's no actual commercial operating experience to support such high capture rates, as we'll see from the next slide. This is the data for 11 of the 27 carbon capture projects around the world that were operating in 2022. Firstly, this shows that none of these projects had capture rates anywhere near 94.5 or 96.2%. One of the 11 for Air Liquide hydrogen production facility in Normandy in France, actually the 60%, the only figure I could find was from a DOE publication. I think it's an estimate of the capture rate, but I decided to include it in this chart with that explanation. You can see from this that if you include the power and the emissions from either the power to run the carbon capture system or from the carbon capture system itself, the most that any project is captured is 67 to 75% at the Petronova project, a coal plant in, I think it's south of Houston, Texas. No other project other than perhaps Quest has come close, and none of them have come close to 90% or 95% capture. Next slide, please. So then on what evidence does the DOE base its assumed high CO2 capture rates? First is there are numerous tests going on now of new and enhanced capture technologies, and it's small scale testing designed to capture, depending on the test, 1% or maybe as much as 5% of the CO2 produced by a power plant. But it's certainly not full-scale testing. And the industry should have learned, and the DOE should have learned, that when you upscale projects from small-scale tests to commercial scale plants, that unexpected and unhappy surprises sometimes happen. So you should not take the results of small-scale testing at face value and assume merely because a small-scale test captures a lot of CO2, has a high capture rate, that necessarily or definitely will translate into a high capture rate at an actual commercial scale facility. The other evidence the DOE bases its assumed high CO2 capture rates, at least from what we can glean from their studies, are claims by the developers of proposed hydrogen production facilities and the vendors of carbon capture equipment for projects that have not yet been built or operated, or not even under construction, and some of which have not even yet been funded. So they're not close to full development. Next slide, please. This slide, taken from an April 2022 report by DOE's, it's called NETL, N-E-T-L, National Energy Technology Lab, is what the data that we used to prepare this chart came from this DOE study, and the data was used to explain why they believed that the high capture rates being assumed in the study, the ones that I mentioned before, are reasonable. There are the very low actual rates at existing plants, actual capture rates. And then there are 7 projects, again, none of which has been fully built, only one of which is announced it's even begun construction, and some of which are not yet funded. So the assumed projects, the proposed projects assume high capture rates. The actual projects have low capture rates. Now, we believe that there are reasons to be optimistic that future carbon capture rates will be higher. But there's a big jump to go from 50 and 60% to 95 or 96%. Next slide, please. Why is the carbon capture rate important? Simple. The higher the carbon capture rate assumed, the lower the carbon intensity of the hydrogen being produced. Simple as that. Again, you see here that facilities, even with the built-in high carbon capture rates in GREET, facilities with ATR technology don't meet the federal standard. And while those with SMR technology do, it's just clean by a small margin. And now I will turn the presentation over to my colleague and co-author, Anika.
Thank you, David. So the fourth key assumption that helps make the carbon intensity of blue hydrogen appear low is that the life cycle analysis doesn't include any of the downstream emissions beyond the back gate of the hydrogen production facility, except for some of those related to the transport, injection, and storage of the CO2 that's captured during the production process. Next. In order to understand the carbon intensity of different fuels, life cycle analyses are done to estimate emissions from the cradle to grave, so that all emissions from the point of raw material extraction to the use of a fuel are encompassed. The use of LCAs makes it possible to compare fuels to one another in terms of their total emissions. But in the case of hydrogen, the DOE and the IRA have mandated a well-to-gate life cycle analysis. And specifically for blue hydrogen, this envelope includes upstream emissions related to the production and delivery of natural gas, as well as emissions related to the electricity generation for hydrogen production and carbon dioxide management. But as I mentioned, except for some of the emissions related to the transport and storage of the CO2 captured, the life cycle analysis covers emissions only up to the back gate of the production facility, the point at which gaseous hydrogen exists, but at a low pressure. As a result, the downstream emissions related to hydrogen are not included. Next. Hydrogen is an indirect greenhouse gas that contributes to global warming by affecting how quickly methane is broken down or removed from the atmosphere. Current studies indicate it has a 20-year GWP that's 33 times that of CO2. And we know this tiny molecule will be difficult to control throughout the processes of transport, distribution, and storage, and we know that leaks will occur. The leaks will be difficult to detect if they're below a safety threshold, and the technology needed to detect such leaks is just being developed. Current scientific papers indicate that leakage could be as high as 10% across the hydrogen value chain. And so with the White House anticipating 10 million metric tons of hydrogen being produced by 2030 in the US alone, hydrogen leakage could become a very significant contributor to global warming. Next slide. Excluding the downstream emissions related to hydrogen from the total carbon intensity estimates obscures how dirty blue hydrogen would be. But just because Congress and the DOE do not mandate the inclusion of those emissions in the LCA, it doesn't mean that they don't exist, and it doesn't mean that they're insignificant either. Next. The more realistic assumptions we made in this study are based on available performance and leakage data, and we considered 20 and 100-year global warming potentials, a range of emissions, the methane emissions from 1%, which is the GREET default, up to 4%, with a midpoint of 2.5%. We looked at several carbon capture rates. We looked at those maximum GREET values of 96.2% for SMR and 94.5% for ATR, as well as 85% and 70%. We also looked at downstream emissions that include an estimate of 5% hydrogen leakage and emissions from the electricity required to compress the hydrogen enough to make it ready to transport as a gas. We didn't include electricity needed to liquefy the hydrogen or to reboost its pressure if it was transported over long distances. We used the GREET model, the DOE GREET model, to estimate the well-to-gate carbon intensity of the blue hydrogen and then added on the estimate of those selected downstream emissions. Again, as we've mentioned, these are not worst-case scenarios that we're talking about. We assumed higher carbon capture rates than any commercial-scale hydrogen production facility has realized, and the methane emission rates reflect a national average, but some areas, such as the Permian Basin, have leaks measured at more than 9%. And we've also just included a portion of the downstream emissions. Next. So how dirty could blue hydrogen be? Well, compared to the model default, the realistic scenarios shown here indicate that blue hydrogen would be between 3 and 7 times dirtier. Moving across this chart from left to the right, the model default scenario reflects the default case from the GREET model. That's 100-year global warming potentials, those maximum very high carbon capture rates, 1% upstream methane emissions, and it does not include downstream emissions at all, because the default model case is the well-to-gate scenario that's mandated by DOE. The realistic low case keeps the 1% methane emissions rate, but changes to a 20-year GWP time horizon and a lower but still very optimistic 85% carbon capture rate. The downstream emissions included here are hydrogen leakage at 5%, and emissions from the electricity required to compress the hydrogen for transport as a gas. The realistic high case also reflects 20-year GWPs. Methane emissions are on the higher end of our selected range at 4%. The 70% carbon capture rate used in this case is lower, but it's still beyond the performance of CCS at existing hydrogen production facilities. The downstream emissions, again, reflect a 5% hydrogen leakage rate and compression of the hydrogen gas. While this case represents the high end of our realistic range of estimates, these parameters are still quite optimistic. With these assumptions, blue hydrogen is more than 4 times dirtier than the clean hydrogen standard. Next slide. Oh, could you go back one, Susan? The mid-range realistic case has a total carbon intensity that's 3 to 4 times the clean standard. We assumed 20-year global warming potentials, a moderate upstream methane emission rate of 2.5%, a very optimistic 85% carbon capture rate that is yet to be realized at a commercial scale facility. And the downstream emissions reflect that 5% hydrogen leakage rate and emissions from electricity required to compress the hydrogen to a gas ready for transport. While the model paints a rosy picture of blue hydrogen's carbon intensity, real-world conditions and a more complete life cycle analysis tell a different story. Blue hydrogen is not clean. Now I'll turn it back to David to highlight our conclusions. Next slide.
We have 4 conclusions. Contrary to the claims of blue hydrogen proponents, the fuel is not clean or low carbon, and it never will be. Second, unless you accept all of the unrealistic default assumptions built into the DOE GREET model, producing blue hydrogen from natural gas is shown to have carbon intensities potentially as high as 5 times the DOE's clean standard. 3, there is a significant risk that the support and funding of blue hydrogen projects will make global warming worse because projects built in the coming years will continue to produce high carbon intensity blue hydrogen for decades. And lastly, neither the US federal government nor state governments should be funding dirty blue hydrogen production projects. And we're ready for questions.
Thank you, David and Anika, for that great presentation. If you are a participant, I know we have one question in the chat we'll get started with really quickly, but if you have any questions, put them in the Q&A and we will start to take those. But to get us kicked off, I wanted to emphasize something that you said in your presentation. Are you saying that the unrealistic default assumptions in the GREET model cannot ever become realistic?
No, that for as Anika and I have both mentioned, there on 3 of the 4 assumptions, we're optimistic. I mean, our assumptions contain some optimism, but optimism has to be balanced with reality. The only assumption where there's really not much place to be optimistic is in the exclusion of 20-year global warming potentials. And as I explained, given that the crisis is here today and we have to make decisions about what technology options to use in the near future, we have to include 20-year global warming potentials. That doesn't mean get rid of the 100-year numbers, just include 20-year global warming potentials.
Great, thank you. And we'll go to our first audience question, and it represents, I'll go back really quickly on, I believe it was this side. So from Woody Hastings, in regards to slide 17, which I've pulled up here, and for all this captured carbon, what is being done with it? How is it being stored or repurposed? If stored, how can we have confidence that there is no leakage over time?
Good question. 75% of the CO2 that has been captured to date has been used for enhanced oil recovery, in which it has been injected back into the ground to produce oil that would otherwise not have been either economically or technically feasible to produce. When that oil is either used as a feedstock for petrochemicals or is burned, carbon dioxide is released. Depending on your assumptions, part of the CO2 that's captured is offset by the additional CO2 emissions from the burning or use of the oil produced through EOR. Now, again, depending on your assumptions, either part or all of the CO2 that's captured is offset. So there are many who believe that more CO2 is emitted through EOR than is captured at a power plant or production facility. As to whether we can trust that it'll be stored for permanently underground, I don't. And the evidence suggests that people should not have confidence of it. One of our colleagues at IEEFA, Grant Hauber, I think a month or so ago, released a report about the 2 carbon capture projects in Norway that are held up to the world as examples of see it can work, where CO2 that's captured is stored under the North Sea. Well, the geology tells a different story. The Norwegians believed that they knew where the CO2 would go and where it would stay when it was injected, the captured CO2. Turns out it went to locations different than what they expected, that even though they had done state-of-the-art and extensive pre-injection examinations using state-of-the-art technology, I meant, they still couldn't be sure where the CO2 would go. And once it's underground, there's not much, and I actually can't think of anything that you can do to remedy that situation except look for a different place to inject the CO2.
Great, thank you. We'll go to our next question. Can the DOE shore up its requirements for funding to resolve any of these issues? And if so, how?
DOE is obligated, I guess, to fund the hydrogen hubs. But what projects are funded is within the DOE purview. They could spend less money on blue hydrogen and more on green hydrogen made from renewables. Although we have concerns about the downstream emissions that Anika talked about, the hydrogen-related downstream emissions from green hydrogen as well as blue. But that's something they could do. They could talk to the Department of Treasury about the regulations it's going to establish for the production tax credits for clean hydrogen. And I believe most important, they could tell the truth to the American people. I mean, I think that that would have a big impact. Maybe people would put pressure on Congress to clean up their funding of blue hydrogen projects.
Great, thank you. Next question is, can you share again which of these changed variables, 20 to 100 GWP capture rate, up downstream emissions, are most impactful, or are they roughly equal in impact?
Yeah, I can I can take that one. That's a great question. Thank you for asking that. The upstream methane leakage rate is definitely a big driver in terms of calculating the overall carbon intensity, particularly when you're looking at it on a 20-year GWP basis. So at a 100-year GWP basis, for every 1% increase in upstream emissions rates, there's a 0.9 kilogram CO2e per kilogram hydrogen increase in the carbon intensity. But when you're looking at that on a 20-year GWP basis, it jumps to 2.5 kilogram CO2e per kilogram hydrogen. So that's a huge driver, and it's really difficult to control those upstream emissions. Fugitive emissions, detecting emissions along long stretches of pipeline, et cetera. So managing those, that methane before it even gets to the production facility is really important.
Great, thank you, Anika. Next question. Several countries, including Indonesia, are currently studying the blue hydrogen option to transit from coal. In terms of investment and resources poured in for this option, what would you say to them? What alternatives would you suggest for the energy transition?
The answer is at least simple to me. Renewables, battery storage, energy efficiency have been proven. Are we going to be able to do that overnight? No, nobody's expecting this energy transition to happen overnight. But spending money on those alternatives is better than spending money on blue hydrogen, which will make the situation worse.
Great, thank you. Next question. How significant is the energy penalty from capturing the CO2 and restoring the solvent? Some suggest 25 to 30%.
Well, I love the question, but the answer depends on who's doing the study and when it's being done. For example, what's called a FEED study, front-end engineering design study, was done for the proposed carbon capture, the proposed retrofit of the now retired San Juan generating station in northwest New Mexico. It was planning to use a technology from Mitsubishi Heavy Industries of America. And it assumed slightly more than a 50% of energy penalty, that the net power output would be about half of what it is before the retrofit. Other studies show 5%, a low of 15%. Generally ballpark, it's 20 to 30, 35% is the ballpark. Email me and we can continue this discussion. As you can tell, I get very animated about it.
Great, thank you, David. Next question. Have you been able to share your research with the governor's office? I would assume that's governors of the proposed hydrogen hub states. And do you feel the advancement of the hydrogen hub can be halted?
I'm pessimistic about being able to halt the project in the hubs, or the funding for the projects in the hubs today. But I think that if we can spread the results of our study and talk to people in states and in the federal government, it's going to take several years for the funding process to work out. It's not as if when the DOE announces the list of hubs that are going to be funded, the money they're going to give out, $8 billion, seems like a lot of money, right? It's nothing compared to what it's going to cost to fully build out the facilities that are likely to be in the plans for each of these hubs. If they don't get additional funding from governments or funding from investors, the projects will not go anywhere. So yes, there is plenty of time to stop these projects if they deserve to be stopped.
Great, thank you. Next question. In your analysis, you are using the government's clean hydrogen production target versus continuing on our current fossil burning trajectory. What is the alternative hypothesis for preventing carbon emissions? And is the use of green or pink hydrogen even feasible given the timelines required for action?
Anika, you want to?
Sure. Well, I think in our presentation, we were looking at the clean hydrogen standard as being something that needed some closer examination to see whether or not this is even, kind of a feasible thing. But I think what we would say would be that, if the government has billions of dollars to put into technologies that are going to result in mitigating climate change, then that money might be better spent in renewables, investing in other existing technologies we know work that can come online a lot sooner. And kind of speaking to the second part of your question, pink hydrogen, if you're talking about using existing nuclear power facilities to create pink hydrogen, maybe that's feasible. But there are questions about what are the potential leakages if you're storing hydrogen once you start moving it around. Once we start looking at some of those downstream emissions, hydrogen might not even be clean using those technologies. So we would say that the comparison is not between blue hydrogen and business as usual. It's looking at blue hydrogen as not being a solution, and renewables we would advocate would be a better solution. Did you want to add anything to that, David?
Yes, I have one word to add to that, although it'll take me more than one word to explain it. The one word is water. Mm-hmm. Water has been absent from a great deal of the discussion around hydrogen of any color. Is there enough water to support the production of hydrogen from nuclear or renewables. I'm very skeptical, to be honest, especially after doing our report and looking at news reports about droughts around the nation, let alone in areas of the world that don't have even the water resources of drought areas in the US. But we have not studied that in detail yet. We hope to in the future.
Great, thank you. Next question. How do frontline community groups defend against this hydrogen hype and communicate with the DOE about concerns over hydrogen hub designations?
I don't know the answer to that. I'll be brutally honest, which is what you expect of someone or should expect of someone in a webinar. I don't think the DOE wants to hear from the people. I think they've made it pretty clear they don't want input from the people. Try to talk to them, talk to your legislators, see if you can get them to get the meetings with the DOE. Today they issued some kind of notice. I didn't have a chance to read it before the webinar about community benefits from doing hydrogen hubs and carbon capture projects, or maybe it was just carbon capture projects. But the benefits they talk about are generally jobs, which are important, of course, but they don't talk much about health and environmental benefits or harms from fossil fuel projects. So put pressure on the DOE and your legislators, state and federal. It is about the best that I can offer.
Great, we have time for a few more questions. It's 5 to the end of the hour, so I think we'll do one more. And if we don't get to your questions, I'll put up right now actually our contact information, and we'll follow up with you as we wrap up here. So next question we will tackle is the NOAA reports on atmospheric methane concentrations show it rising rapidly since the fracking boom began to over 1900 ppb. Does that tell us anything about the true methane leakage rates? 1%, 2.5%, 4%, 95%.
Well, we've relied on the scientific studies that have looked at the emission rates. Most recently from airplanes and satellites. And those rates appear to be in the ballpark, plus or minus, of 2.5%. That's why we've chosen that as the midpoint of our analysis. Now, is it possible they could get better over time? I sure hope so. But even if they do, blue hydrogen's still a bad idea, as our analysis shows.
Great, I think we can do one more. There's a clarifying question. So you stated when you first started talking about GREET that you have no problem with the model, but then we talk about several unrealistic assumptions in the model. So don't unrealistic assumptions amount to a flawed model?
You want me to take that one?
Sure.
Okay. It's a good clarifying question. I think the intent behind that statement was to say that the people designing the model are creating a model, but they are receiving guidance about the parameters and the assumptions to make in that model using, it's a combination of the evidence that they have and whatever other directives they're getting and directions. So the model does a lot of work. It is, you know, something that people can access. We use the Excel-based version of it, and you can get in there, you can change a lot of parameters. So it does function that way. Could it be improved? Yes. And it's, you know, it's kind of, they adapted an existing model, one that was designed to look at fuel use and emissions in transportation cases for this particular use. So it's sort of, you know, there's some awkwardness there, but the model is the model. But we take issue with the assumptions around the default inputs that were put there. And if you have other more specific questions about that, I would be happy to talk more with you about that if you just send me an email.
Great, thank you guys so much. Do you have any final words you would like to leave with us as we wrap up here?
The only one I have is that the webinar is being recorded, will be available on the IEEFA website. Our slides will be available on the IEEFA website. And as Anika and I have each said, we're happy to engage with you folks more. If some of you would like to organize a webinar or some panel discussion, we'd be happy to work with you. Thanks for coming.
Yeah. Thank you everybody for good questions and listening to our presentation today. And please reach out if you have other questions or would like to know more about it.